Welcome to Cornell Keynotes. My name is Heather Murray, and I'm the Associate Director of the Cornell Law School First Amendment Clinic and the Managing Attorney of its Local Journalism Project, where I primarily provide pro bono legal assistance to journalists and teach students how to litigate. The clinic has two streams of matters. We have what we call our free speech matters, and that could be fighting a book ban in Idaho or defending school speech in Michigan, to take just two examples. And our second stream of matters, local journalism, relates to one of the innovations in our clinic that we'll be talking about today, which is our local journalism project. We take on matters mostly in New York, Pennsylvania, and in Vermont, but also farther afield in Texas and Arizona. We do all manner of pro bono legal services for journalists, from pre-publication review to help stories get published, to defending them in a libel suit or defending them if they get subpoenaed for their sources, to access work to help journalists litigate freedom of information requests, seeking documents that hold government accountable, to negotiating copyright claims, and providing corporate and organizational advice. I'd like to turn now to today's topic, which is the state of local journalism, and our featured panelists. To my left, I have Gersh Kuntzman, Editor-in-Chief of Streets Blog in New York City, which connects people to information about how to reduce dependence on cars and improve conditions for walking, biking, and transit. And to his left, we have Mazen Zdahmed, the co-founder and executive director of Documented, a nonprofit newsroom dedicated to covering and serving immigrant communities in New York City. And to his left, we have Michael Lindhorst, who is our local journalism attorney based in New York City, who provides pro bono legal assistance to Documented, to Streets Blog, and to many of our other journalist clients in the New York City metro area. Thank you all for traveling up from New York City to be with us today for this important conversation. To start us off, Mazen and Gersh, could you each tell us about your backgrounds in journalism?
You go first. Sure. So great to be here. My first time in Ithaca, so thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I'm a journalist. Before starting Documented, I was a reporter in the Middle East. I worked as a reporter at a small local English language newspaper called the Daily Star before relocating to the US and was covering immigration for The Guardian and other publications in New York City. When me and my co-founder Max first started to have the idea to launch Documented.
Great.
I wish I could follow that with something intelligent. I have a very different background. I started in community news in New York City in the 80s. That's the 1980s for anybody following at home. As a community journalist, you kind of learn journalism the wrong way because you're covering the community. But the community itself is never really defined. Is it the loudest people at a community board? Is it the people who will be positively affected by change, who never show up at a community board? So that was my crucible of journalism. Then I went on to work at the New York Post and the New York Daily News, learning to kind of do the legacy journalism before joining Streets Blog, where we do, we'll talk about it later obviously, but we do sort of advocacy journalism, but the journalism is the solid core of what we do, but it's a slightly different type of reporting because you're focusing on a movement. In our case, the Livable Streets movement, the kind of stuff you do with immigration, et cetera. So it's funny to become a good journalist at the end of my career, starting out as a real journalist. I was a real journalist before I was a good journalist.
Thank you. And Mike, for people meeting the Local Journalism Project for the first time, what do you actually do day to day in working with New York City metro area clients?
Yeah, thank you, Heather. So we're trying to provide our clients with all their legal needs. The idea being that unlike legacy news outlets, small and local and startup news outlets aren't able to afford their own lawyers most of the time, so we provide pro bono legal assistance. And that can be in anything from trying to get records out of the government, right, suing government agencies to get public records that belong to the public, to defending journalists who are facing a subpoena, trying to force them to reveal their anonymous sources, to working on day-to-day contract issues or pre-publication review issues, to make sure that the articles that are being published aren't exposing the news outlets to any legal liability. So we try to help them in whatever legal ways they need help with.
Great. And just for viewers listening from home, we're interested in hearing from you today, and we'll be taking your questions, so please submit them in the chat. And there'll be resources and tools and useful links in the chat as well. And as always, today's live stream is being recorded and will be available to view shortly after the show's over today. All right, well, let's get into it. Start with the work on the ground. And Mazen, Documented has a community-driven journalism model focusing on serving immigrant communities. Could you explain to our listeners what that means and what learnings you are channeling from Documented into your recently launched immigrant media training program?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So Documented, as you said, Documented's mission is to cover New York City's immigrants and the policies that affect their lives. So it was really started by my co-founder Max and I because we felt like there was a real hole in the way immigration reporting was happening. This was 2018, so it was the first Trump administration. There was a huge emphasis on what was going on the border and what was happening in DC. So both of us, obviously, we'd covered migration. I was a reporter in the Middle East, as I mentioned, so was Max. And Max had worked at a bunch of different regional papers across the US. And we felt that no one was actually covering what was happening at the local level, how all of these policy shifts coming out of DC were actually impacting immigrants in the place where most of them live, big US cities like New York. And that's largely because, as I'm sure all of you know, local news has been decimated. So the kind of reporters that could actually cover the Byzantine complex issue of immigration had all been laid off years ago as newspapers had been shrinking for some time. So we felt there was a need for a dedicated news source providing on-the-ground, up-to-date information about what was going on around immigration. But critically, both of us had had this experience as reporters where the people we were covering were not the people who would end up reading the stories. So, you know, I was a reporter in Lebanon. I often share about how I would always go to the border with Syria. I speak Arabic. This was like the height of the Syrian refugee crisis. I'd spend a whole day at a Syrian refugee camp, and people would be so generous with me. They'd invite me into their camps. They'd tell me these heart-wrenching stories about how they traveled from Syria to Lebanon. Then I go back to my office in Beirut, and I'd write a story that they would never read or engage with. And that relationship always felt very extractive. So we wanted to create Documented in a way that the people actually affected by these issues were also the people reading the stories. So in order to do that, we developed this model where we actually start off by listening first. So we go out to immigrant communities and we try and understand what are their information needs. One of the first partnerships we did was with some students at NYU. We went out into, so I don't know if I'm allowed to mention NYU here, but it's okay.
We'll allow it.
Cornell
We'll allow
was
it.
a friend of NYU.
Okay.
Ezra loved NYU.
Got it. Okay. Good to know. Good to know. So we partnered with some students there, and they went out and they surveyed undocumented Spanish speakers and asked them, what do you actually want from a news source? What would actually be useful to you in your day-to-day life? How can we do something with our journalism skills that actually be useful to you? And they came back with three main findings. First was immigrants felt that whenever they were featured in the news, they were either featured as victims or criminals. There was no nuance in the way that they were portrayed. Number two, people wanted actionable information, news they could use on a day-to-day basis. And number three, most people were getting their news from WhatsApp. Informal WhatsApp, you know, a church group, a block group, whatever it might be. That was where people were finding out what was going on in New York. So we launched Documented Semanal, which was a weekly newsletter distributed via WhatsApp that would go out to undocumented Spanish speakers. And it grew over many years into this vibrant two-way communication channel where now we have thousands of people who are subscribed, who now lead our editorial agenda and dictate what we should be covering in Spanish. And we did similar things for Chinese immigrants in New York and for Haitian Creole speakers in New York as well, and built similar products. So we started, as we were building this work, we started hearing from newsrooms around the country that they also wanted to, you know, better serve immigrant communities. Somebody's in a town where there's a Hmong community that has grown in the last couple of years. They want their local news to be a better service to them. How can we do that? So about a year and a half ago, we partnered with the Knight Foundation to build a program where we could actually start training people on this model of how you listen to immigrant communities, then build products to actually continuously listen on a two-way basis and build news and editorial agendas that are actually responsive to their needs.
That's great. So you're improving the news ecosystem, not just in New York City, but throughout the country with
We're
this,
trying,
this
yes.
program.
Yeah, that's the hope,
great.
yeah.
Gersh, your outlet's owned by Open Plans, which promotes civic engagement for livable streets. How does that single issue focus, or what does that mean for street blog sustainability and for its coverage? And are you filling a need that wasn't being met before?
Oh, well, we're definitely filling a need that wasn't being met. Streets Blog started about 20 years ago. I didn't start it, so this is not me talking out of school. About 20 years ago, most of the mainstream papers, sort of like what you were talking about, how your mission, most of the mainstream papers, in addition to being hollowed out, weren't covering, well, what we called broadly the livable streets movement, how people get around, bike lanes, pedestrian plazas, issues related to the streetscape. And it occurred to me when you were talking, it's like, well, the audience for those is everybody in the city, just as yours was for all the immigrants, et cetera. But they weren't being served because the newspapers, you know, for example, the New York Times or the New York Post or the Daily News, really covered everything from top down. Nobody was really talking about, like, how do people actually get around? There was subway coverage, obviously, but very little on buses and very little about how those streets are designed by the Department of Transportation to be safer, which has been a product of Vision Zero over the last 15, 20 years. So we filled that niche of like just covering, okay, well, how do we get around? And then that has expanded, as you said, that local papers are being hollowed out. That's expanded into how police operate in public space, policing of public space. You know, for example, people of color get all of the jaywalking tickets, literally all of the jaywalking tickets. So only black people jaywalk? Obviously not. I jaywalk all the time. So that's policing in public space. Also, the use of, just the sheer use of public space. We're going to use it for outdoor dining, for example, instead of parking. Creating more public plazas, it's planting trees, the Parks Department, et cetera. So we've broadened our mission as the mainstream media has hollowed out a bit. But obviously not as ambitious an agenda as, I mean, you're covering the world and local immigrant communities. I mean,
We're trying.
that's not easy. But our mission is narrow, and you mentioned Open Plans. Obviously, we share a parent company. Open Plans is a lobbying and policy shop. So we do have a Chinese wall between us and them, but they are covering or advocating for the same thing that we are covering, which is a city where people used to talk about the quality of life as only being an issue of crime, for example. No, quality of life affects everything. Quality of life is, can I get around on a bike without getting killed by a car driver? Can I take the bus and have the bus not being blocked by car drivers? And these are issues that actually connect to people because getting around is one of the most basic things.
Great. And Mazen, are you seeing news outlets collaborating and partnering more with other news outlets in this environment, and what benefits do you see that can come from that collaboration?
Well, yeah, as Gersh was mentioning about the hollowing out, I think in this environment where resources are scarce, there's just been way more willingness for newsrooms to work together. I think if you go back to the 90s, there was just, deathly competition, people really fiercely fighting to be first on stories, and the idea of two newsrooms collaborating was unheard of. Today, it's the norm, I'd say, like across the media industry. And in New York, in the New York ecosystem, for instance, Documented shares its offices with the city and another newsroom called Civic News that oversees Chalkbeat as well. We regularly partner on stories. We did an amazing wage theft project that was, hugely supported by the clinic. There was a partnership with ProPublica. So I think partnership has become the norm, and I think our industry is a lot healthier for it.
I would jump on to say the one area where collaboration can help is if you have an outlet that has a similar, not ideology necessarily, but a worldview. Because, for example, we wanted to partner with outlets on delivery workers, for example. We covered delivery workers intensely. But the problem is a lot of the mainstream outlets see the delivery workers as some sort of dangerous rogue force in New York City, whereas we feel like the oligarchs who are running the delivery apps are the rogue force. And if you're out there, we're coming for you. No, I mean, these are delivery apps that are billion-dollar industries, and they are sending delivery workers, in some cases, to their death around the city. You try to partner with the New York Post on that, and they just want to write about how the delivery workers are rogue cyclists, and that's hard. You have to find the right outlet.
Well, we should form a partnership.
We're gonna work on that,
Yeah, we
yeah.
should work together on that,
Yeah.
actually. I'll be very interested. I think the other kind of recipe for success in a partnership is when it's clear what the strengths of both parties are. So like in the ProPublica partnership, for instance, they had some data analysis tools that maybe we didn't have. We partnered with the city because maybe they had an investigative desk that was able to do some more sophisticated FOIA requests or things of that nature than we were able to do. So those types of relationships where it's clear we maybe have community relationships that they don't have, and we can both bring our strengths and bring them together. I think those are when the strongest partnerships happen.
Great. Newsrooms are under increasing pressure under the Trump administration, and are you seeing threats that face local newsrooms as being different in kind today from a decade ago, or are they just more frequent?
Well, the main threat from the Trump administration is more just this disgust for journalists. They don't really respect the way we go about our work, and they don't really respect the finished product. And then that does, I find in the public, there's a degradation of the respect for journalism as a product, right? So we send reporters out to community board meetings or on the street or what, and the kind of lack of respect for the work we do is really troubling because everyone's a partisan now, so you can't really ask even man on the street or woman on the street questions anymore because everybody's, it is a very partisan environment. And I do think that comes from the very top where we have a president who basically says the work we do is of no value, we're an enemy of the public, when in fact, you know better than anybody, we are not an enemy of the public. Right. You know? So that's the biggest thing, and there is obviously violence in our, journalists have been threatened physically and have been shot, and so there is that, and I'm not saying that never happened before, but it's certainly happening in much more frequently.
Yeah, I think we've been really concerned about some of the rhetoric and potential threats that have been coming out of the administration. We're very blessed to have an incredible First Amendment bar in the US. I think the clinic is an incredible example of that. And I feel that we've been really equipped with ways to try and protect ourselves against some of these threats, thanks to just a lot of proactive work from folks like yourselves and others in your space. And I think that generally, as we're thinking about our philosophy as a newsroom, there's just a kind of overall lack of trust in institutions in our society today. And media is like one of those, but just across the board, what Trump has successfully done is just make people have a lack of faith in any institution. The way we're trying to combat that is to try and make our journalists into real humans. So you're not speaking to a large institution, you're speaking to Romel. Romel is a human being on this WhatsApp. He sends you a message every morning. Here's how he does his work day in and day out. This is how you build a relationship with somebody. People send him a good morning text, with a little emoji on it. So he's having a real relationship with somebody so that when he does deliver news or tell you that something is false, people will have more trust in it.
There's an irony to what you said, if I could jump in.
Yes.
That Trump does challenge our faith in institutions, right? But that's what we do too. Our job is to challenge the institutions.
It's true.
So there's always that little kernel of something there that unfortunately you have to tip your hat sometimes.
I like to think that we're strengthening the institutions by challenging them, and
That's
that
right.
we're holding them to a standard of what they claim to be and they should be, as opposed to, the project of Doge is just to eliminate the entire government because it's useless. But I take your point.
Yeah, it's two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, it's true.
I mean, I think that's what you do best as journalists, holding government accountable, right? And Mawson, you already started to touch on this. Does it make a difference that you have pro bono legal support from the clinic? And are there things you wouldn't be able to do at all in this environment or do as well without our help?
Yeah, I think we'd be lost without the clinic. I'm not just saying that because I'm here. Like, for instance, there are just so many examples. I'm in pretty regular touch with both of you. And there's just a litany of examples of ways in which the clinic has supported us. The wage theft monitor. So just to give a background on the wage theft work, we did a listening tour of different immigrant serving organizations, really during the height of ICE arrests in New York during the first Trump administration, to ask them what they wanted from us, what kind of journalism we should be doing in their member meetings. And despite all of this ICE activity, the number one issue people told us they were facing was wage theft. People consistently stealing their wages, and the delivery workers with these companies are victims of that also. So my co-founder Max had this idea that he thought would be quite straightforward, which is, one way that somebody could maybe combat wage theft or defend themselves against wage theft is if they knew who the wage thieves were. So he was going to ask the State Department of Labor for all the people that they had convicted of wage theft, thinking they would more than happily give up this information because it makes them look great to see all these cases that they'd adjudicated. And to his surprise, they refused to give him the information. And we launched into what became a 4-year FOIL lawsuit with the Department of Labor in New York State that was entirely led by the clinic. And eventually we were able to get the data, analyze the data, and it has had just tremendous impact since, the introduction of multiple different pieces of legislation in Albany, a change in regulations at the horse racing agency in New York State, and a number of different lawyers have built cases on the back of the wage theft database. So, and now the Department of Labor does publish that information on their website, and they've created a searchable database on their website after all of this. So none of that would have been possible without the clinic.
Yeah, it's all due to your work. And people should visit that website.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, NewYorkWageTheftData.com, yeah.
Exactly. Great. Mike, why don't I turn to you, Gersh, if you had anything to add on that.
Well, it was
front.
similar. We once, I think you guys helped us. The NYPD has these rogue officers. I use the term rogue loosely because we're on a legal show, but they were rogues because they were covering their plates with devices or plastic that you couldn't photograph the plate, so they couldn't get speed camera tickets. And we thought, well, this is great. The NYPD will be happy to tell us the officers that they disciplined for doing that. And they wouldn't, obviously.
Right, of course.
Even though it would have made them look good. So you guys, I think, helped us put a legal backbone on. Like I was just kind of sitting there like with a little comic book fuming out of my head, thinking, how are we going to get these guys? And you guys were able to figure out, well, no, there's actually law related to disciplinary records, or so that was very helpful. And we've had a bunch of times like that where it's like similar to the Department of Labor, like agencies that exist to actually hold people accountable should be very happy to tell us, and they are not happy to tell us, even though the story is going to read really very positively, like the Department of Labor cracked down on these 5 bad guys.
Right.
They won't do it. It's crazy, but that's where the clinic comes in, because things, well, goes without saying, things that I don't know, obviously, but the legal framework for journalists sit around in the office and we're like, oh, we're really upset that these people's wages are being stolen. Oh, that makes us really angry. We would like to help. And then, without legal representation, it's really hard because no one will tell you anything unless you have a guy like Michael to say, hey, we're going to sue you for that.
Exactly.
So that's nice. So thank you for that.
Yeah, well, I'm always happy to help, and those sorts of public records lawsuits under the Freedom of Information Law, that's part of our bread and butter, is try to get those public records that belong to the public, should be made public, trying to get those out and hold people accountable.
I think that's a nice lead into the next question, because I was going to ask you to walk us through a case or two, and maybe you could start actually with an ongoing case for Streets Blog. Right. So one of these FOIL lawsuits for Streets Blog, we sued the New York City Department of Transportation because, of course, Streets Blog files a lot of records requests with the DOT about all kinds of different things. And every request that your reporters were putting in, DOT was coming back saying it's going to be 6 months before we give you anything. So an automatic 6-month delay, regardless of whether the request was seeking just one narrow document or a range of documents, which violates the law, because the law requires documents to be produced promptly within a reasonable timeline. And what's reasonable depends on what you're asking for. If it's one document, it shouldn't take 6 months to produce it. So we filed a lawsuit against DOT on behalf of Streets Blog, arguing not only that you should be getting the records that you asked for in those particular requests, but also that DOT needs to stop this unlawful policy of imposing an across-the-board 6-month delay. So that lawsuit is still ongoing. The 6-month delays are still continuing for now, but we're hopeful that we'll succeed, and by doing that, make the system better for all requesters.
hopefully get everybody their records faster.
They have a lot of ways around even the lawsuit because, you know, they say, well, we need 6 months because you guys ask too many questions, right? And we don't have the staff to handle this. Well, in fact, they are understaffed in that office, and they need to, and through the lawsuit, we revealed that they are understaffed. They need to have proper staffing to ask the questions. But by delaying 6 months, and then they often extend it by another 3 months or more, the reason we foil stuff is because we need to know in the moment, like, oh, what was on the commissioner's schedule that day when he or she made an important decision, you know, who was in the room. Well, if they don't tell you that for a year, there's another commissioner, the decisions, so much stuff has happened that is now made the question irrelevant. And so we can't inform the public if we don't get information in a timely manner.
And in many cases, that's the strategy on behalf of, on the part of the agency, right? Delay until the information is no longer newsworthy and people are no longer interested. That's one reason we see so many delays. Another reason, like you said, is underfunding. Not enough agents hired to process these requests. But that means they need to hire more officials to do the processing.
No,
right?
or be more transparent. I mean, the Department of Transportation, if you're listening out there, I'm on to you with this. They like us to use their numbers for fatalities or injuries because they clean them up in case like someone died in a crash, but died not because of the crash. So they want to make sure that doesn't count as a fatality. Fine. But they make us email them every time we want those numbers. If they just posted them on their website, then they wouldn't have to I wouldn't have to write the email, they wouldn't have to receive the email. So it's just a waste of time. And whereas transparency is so much easier. We have another problem, which we're going to need you guys on. This is an important one. You're going to benefit from this too.
Let's hear it.
The database, that New York has something called open data, right? So they put everything in there. How many times someone pays a toll, how many times someone gets a speed camera ticket, how many times someone gets a red light ticket. The problem is the database has been collecting that data for like 15 years. It now has so many lines of code, it's billions of lines, that it's useless. You can't use it to sift through it. So we're going to need a lawsuit on that because they need to make that either buy better computers or whatever it is. So
Right.
we need that.
Yeah, we'll take a look
right
and
after.
see what
I mean,
we
we
can
only
do
got a couple of minutes left. So
because yeah, these public records, the public needs to know.
they need to be useful, though. You know.
Exactly.
And when you mentioned earlier the staffing issues, you actually came up with, we were partnering, but you came up with the idea to bring that into the lawsuit. And I'll say that doesn't happen often with clients. We really appreciated that.
Well, I'm a special client.
Yes. And I believe you wanted to bring up another case, the Abraham subpoena defense one.
Oh, right. So other examples beyond public records of how local news outlets need legal help. A lot of it is behind the scenes kind of work, like I mentioned, pre-publication review of articles to check for any legal risks. But sometimes there are not behind the scenes issues. So we had a client a few months ago. He's a local reporter. He received a subpoena trying to get him to reveal the name of an anonymous source. Some litigants in a separate lawsuit thought that the name of this source was relevant to their lawsuit. And without legal help, he might have had to just agree to give it up, even though New York has a very strong law in this situation, the Reporter's Shield law, that protects confidential sources from subpoenas exactly in these circumstances. So we were able to go to court, argue that the subpoena had to be quashed under the Shield law. And it took some effort. We weren't initially successful. We had to appeal. We ended up winning in the appeals court. But without pro bono legal help,
Wow.
that journey wouldn't have been possible, and the reporter probably would have had to give up the name of the source.
The larger issue there, though, is when we write about DoorDash or Grubhub or Instacart especially, these companies have massive legal resources. I mean, we get cease and desist letters from 5 different lawyers from these companies. And that's a form of intimidation, obviously, but it works, though, because they have the ability to hound you in court, whatever. And I mean, they have squadrons of lawyers. Like, they got a murder of lawyers over there. And so it's really been very helpful, no joke, like, to be able to push back and say, well, we have this documentation. You tell us what we need, and then we get it. We show we have it. Otherwise, we would just be like, "Ooh, this is a very serious letter." sounds serious.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you don't have a lawyer in your corner, sometimes you don't know how to respond, and you don't know what's a serious legal threat and what's just smoke.
It's a peace of mind, exactly. Just knowing that you can actually speak to an expert about it.
We occasionally send cease and desist letters on your behalf as
Oh.
well. So
We got these people who are just stealing our copy and they put it up they probably do it
Like
to you.
AI
too.
slop,
all-
right?
Yeah, they do it to
Yeah.
us all the time.
And so sue them or just tell them to stop.
Yeah. Someone has taken, we launched a TikTok in Haitian Creole, and somebody has literally created another account just to kind of generate their own views, where they take our content, re-upload it under the same logo, and just try and like gin up views to get advertising revenue.
See, I would say I'm not a lawyer, but
Yeah.
I think that's illegal.
I'm pretty sure it is. Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Okay, check.
Well, New York still has large legacy news outlets covering the city, but local coverage, as you all know and we've been talking about, has been contracting for well over 15 years now. Where would you say the real holes in coverage are, in your view, and which neighborhoods, communities, and beats are going dark?
Wait, can I challenge the question? Can I
You
challenge
can.
the
You can challenge the question.
The legacy media is definitely contracting. I mean, the New York Times barely covers New York City, and I'm not criticizing, but that's a decision they've made.
Yeah.
But we have people like you, people like me, Chalkbeat,
The City.
the City, the Hellgate, Gothamist,
Yeah.
the Trace, if you're just interested in guns.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of narrow-casted, what we used to call niche publications, but they're not. They're covering a niche, but it's an important niche. So I would say the money, the money is the hard problem. Like the New York Times has a lot of money. So the legacy media has money, and they've contracted their local coverage. Although, in fairness, the New York Post, as much as I have some
I was
problems with
gonna
it,
say.
they are the greatest local paper in the sense that they cover so much stuff. But they don't cover the stuff you're interested in. They don't cover the stuff I'm interested in. They don't cover the stuff the Trace is interested in, Hellgate, any of that stuff. I don't know what they're doing half the time in that newsroom. But they cover local news.
Good headlines to me.
Right, great headlines. So that's why I'm questioning the frame of
Gersh
the
is
question.
a long-time New York Post.
Well, I did work at the Post for 10 years, and it was traumatizing, but also best years of my life. But there's more journalism being created today. If you include social media,
It's a tough one.
I mean, it's not all good, but there
Yeah.
is a lot of news out there. Like you mentioned, even just immigrant communities communicating on WhatsApp.
Yeah.
That's a form of journalism, right? I heard there was a raid. I heard there was this. So there's a lot of journalism out there. There's certainly a lot of news out there. It's just not the legacy media that we were accustomed, when I got into the business.
I think the Daily News is missing for your analysis, because the Daily News.
The New York Daily News? I
Yeah.
didn't put them in my analysis because they do not cover anything from what I can tell.
And then 30 years ago, the Daily News and Newsday had big operations in New York
Yes.
City. And I think the television stations have, I think they're still consistent, but there was more of an ecosystem where they fed off of the newspapers.
that's right.
And the local and ethnic media. So I think the number of, Spanish language papers, the Chinese papers have actually stayed quite strong throughout everything. They've also dwindled a fair bit. So I'm always wondering, because I guess if we just look at raw numbers,
Right.
there are probably less journalists today, at courthouses.
Sure, yeah.
Like just as far as raw numbers.
That's the legacy stuff. Nobody's covering courts like they used to.
Right, and is that like a good for our democracy?
Oh, I never said any of this was good. I just, no, but
But I mean, are we losing something? Because I guess we're doing a lot more with less. So, the 5 guys at Hellgate are doing a lot more than 5 reporters would have done, at a big institution previously. So I think we're doing a lot more with less, and just people's information diets and information environments are different. Like there was a story about the Cleveland Plain-Dealer used to have 12 reporters covering education in Cleveland.
oh my God.
And did they need 12? That's the question. Is that
They
when
had
we're
it.
thinking about when we're thinking about rebuilding local news, what is the correct number? How many education reporters do we need? And I think in New York, as you said, we have a vibrant system. Maybe it doesn't look the same as it did in the 90s, but it is definitely vibrant. And I'm very excited about where we're at today as far as what we're building. But there are definitely holes.
Oh, but the big hole, we're in Ithaca, right? So, far above Cayuga's waters, I figured I'd grab the local paper. I picked up the Ithaca Journal. No offense, if you work at the Ithaca Journal, you're doing the Lord's work, but there was one local story in that paper. It's only a 15-page paper. The rest was just wire. So that's clearly been hollowed out, right? They probably don't even have a staff, let alone 12 education reporters.
That's a Gannett paper.
Okay, well, I worked for Gannett back in the glory days when the champagne was flowing like water. I was an education reporter for Gannett in Westchester, and we had like 4 of us for one little county. So I'm sorry if you work at the Ithaca Journal, and I'm sorry if you're a reader, you're not being served.
There is an online news outlet, Ithaca Voice, that was actually started by a Cornell graduate back in 2014, who then went on to Washington Post and elsewhere. And that outlet is doing a lot of the work that the legacy Gannett outlet used to be doing. And we actually gave a presentation last night to Ithaca Voice donors. So.
Incredible.
Keep up the good work.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, you're both at independent, mission-driven outlets. Are there ways that you think this lets you do work that a legacy newsroom couldn't do?
Yeah, we couldn't exist in a legacy news environment. I think that
That's the problem. That's the
Yes.
problem with the legacy.
Well, that's part of the reason we ended up in the situation we're in, because I think there was a kind of religious tie to a certain way of doing things that didn't allow for innovation. It didn't allow for people to do new and different ways of getting the news out. So I often say this, that the narrative about local news is one of death, is one of, places receding, newspapers getting hollowed out. But in my world and the kind of other entrepreneurs that I see, it feels like a really exciting time, actually. There are so many new projects. There's dozens of news outlets. We were born in 2018. Between 2016 and 2020, we know dozens of other new publications that were born around that time that just have an entire reimagination of what news is and what it should and could be. We have a coalition called the Immigrant News Coalition, which has documented Conecta, Arizona, an outlet serving Spanish speakers in Phoenix, El Timpano, an outlet serving Mayan immigrants in the Bay, and Sahan Journal, an outlet that serves all immigrant communities around Minneapolis. All of us are very different. El Timpano works on SMS. Maritza is mainly focused on WhatsApp. Sahan Journal does incredibly high quality journalism in a number of different platforms. So there's all these different projects that have come out in the last decade or so that's made me really excited about where we're at.
I mean, the other thing you mentioned at the start of the question was the idea of why did we have to create this at all? In the case of Streets blog, well, the New York Times really wasn't covering anything related to transportation other than cars. I mean, and why is that? Because all their advertising money is cars. The New York Post, the New York Daily News were fat on car ads. Every Friday would be 30 pages of car ads. So you think that an editor is ever going to order up a story about someone who's been run over by a car driver? It didn't happen. They weren't covering road violence, for example. They weren't covering street safety or creating more space for people. So there was a big niche, and they would never cover it. And now, slowly over time, you see the New York Times is actually doing a much better job of covering the deleterious impact of automobiles on our cities, which they never really were hip to because they all drive in from the suburbs every day. Well, that's also changing as younger people become editors at the Times.
And we have a viewer question from David, and I think this one goes to Mike. What would be the repercussions for journalists when they're forced to divulge their sources? And what can a journalist do to fight against releasing sources?
That's a great question. There are a number of repercussions. First, for the journalist-source relationship, right? If you promise your source confidentiality and then give up their identity, that source is never going to trust you again, and probably no other source will either. You're going to have a much harder time getting the information you need as a journalist and then getting that information out to the public. From a legal standpoint, there have been some cases that say the journalist could actually be in legal trouble if they make a promise of confidentiality and then break it. Some courts have found that to be a contract, so it's a contract violation. And then just more broadly in terms of the journalism ecosystem, we need journalists to be able to gather information that people in power don't want them to gather, and sometimes that requires promising a source confidentiality. And without a journalist being able to do that, the public won't know this information that the people in power want them want to keep hidden. So yeah, in New York State, there's this shield law that says if you're a reporter and you promise a source confidentiality, you actually can't be forced under any circumstances to disclose the source's information. It's a very strong law. It also says if you gather information from a source and choose not to publish it, including the source's identity, but you didn't make that explicit promise of confidentiality, you can still protect that information, and there's a balancing test for when a person can get the information and when they can't. But in New York, there's that very strong law. Other states have some other laws. There's no national journalism shield law, which is something that every media lawyer agrees we really need to be able to protect reporters and their information gathering. But yeah, that's the key bottom line is you have to be able to protect the ability of journalists to gather information, including gathering it confidentially.
One of the things that we've been most afraid of with this administration was our devices. Obviously, you have all the information about your sources on your devices, and we deal with a lot of undocumented immigrants, and their information is potentially saved on a lot of our devices. And the case that scared all of us was the Washington Post reporter, who the FBI came to her house and seized her devices. I don't know if you can share a little bit about your background on that case, and as far as what legal grounding she has in an instance like that.
Yeah, so the Washington Post case was outrageous because they the feds came in and took all of her devices. She had previously written about how she had a large number of confidential sources throughout the government. So it seemed pretty obvious that the feds were trying to get at those sources, even though their reasoning for why they had to go in and conduct this search was much narrower than trying to get all of her sources.
Wait, I'm not a lawyer, as I might have said a couple of times. I'm not a lawyer, but that sounds illegal. Did they have a warrant?
You're testing my memory. I think they did have a warrant, but just for the more narrow reason. I don't know if any of you remember what they told the judge they were looking for, but it was something narrower than all of her sources. And the Washington Post has been mostly successful in keeping that source information from the government. Even though the feds obtained the devices, they were blocked by the court from reviewing the content of the devices. So it's a partial win, but it's still very concerning for federal law enforcement to come in, seize a reporter's devices, and then just hold on to them, even if they're not searching through
Well,
them.
that's the point, right? It's the intimidation, right?
Exactly.
The idea that, Mazen is sitting here saying, well, wait a minute, now I can't have my sources on my device because they'll find a way. That's not good.
That's the goal.
It's very concerning, right?
And we have a question from Brian that I think goes to both of you. Funding is a huge challenge for local newspapers. What advice can you give?
Oh, I want to talk directly to Brian. You should give to local news organizations like Streets Blog and Documented and Hellgate and others. But I guess he's asking what advice can we give to people trying to start out publications, or?
I think you can interpret it either
Well,
way.
definitely donate.
Right, yes.
Well, you're much better at fundraising than I am. I have a handful of funders who are very generous, and we appeal to them. But
Right, that's what we're looking for.
Yeah.
If you want to
Generous
share any of
people,
those people, yeah. Starting a publication is it's tough. If that's what is it Brian?
Brian.
If that's what you're considering, Brian, I'd be happy to speak. I'm always happy to speak to anybody directly who's thinking about starting a publication. Definitely gave me every gray hair that I currently have. It's
you're a kid.
it's I looked a lot younger.
I see no gray hair.
Yeah. It looked a lot bigger previously.
But starting a
yeah.
publication will give you gray hairs. That's not easy.
100%. Yeah, it is. It's a lot of work. So there's a few different models. I think the place where people get caught up with this question is there was one way of funding news for a really long time, and people are looking for that one thing. That we're going to get back to this period of time when every single news outlet had the exact same business model. That's not going to be the case. You got to find your mix and your way of doing it, and there are so many innovative approaches of doing it out there, and every single one of them has pros and has cons. You know, finding one wealthy benefactor who's going to support your work consistently is fantastic. The con is one day they get bored and then they give up the whole thing and you're in crisis. We have another model where we're supported almost entirely by foundations. It's great because foundations provide, you know, 6-figure grants over multiple years. You can plan around it. And, you know, a lot of people feel that they're quite directive. They're actually not super directive. You know, you have a lot of freedom, but their strategy shifts every 5 years. And you're constantly in this game of chasing where they might be. If you're in a wealthy, affluent community where people care about civic engagement, you can probably have a really good donation strategy. But then you got to worry about writing stories that make your readers angry, and there's downsides to that too. So just figuring out whatever your mix is going to be is the way to do it. And I think right-sizing your cost base is also another part that I think that journalism could be done a lot cheaper today. And you've seen a lot of these, especially the worker co-ops like Hellgate, 404 Media, they've shown that you can have a ton of impact with super low costs. So really thinking about trying to utilize the tools that are out there to lower your costs, I think you can build some sustainable models.
There's one flaw in one of the models. You know, there's a lot of local papers in Manhattan, especially Tribeca Citizen, West Side Rag, Upper East Sight. These are all very vibrant publications. No knock on the publications, but funding them is a challenge, and it's a twofold challenge. One is, like you said, pissing off people. Suddenly, the restaurateur who doesn't like the bike lane is upset that you wrote positively about the bike lane. But then the other thing is, those kind of publications tend to only exist in neighborhoods that have a lot of money or a lot of businesses, and that's not great because, you know, I live in Brooklyn, and we don't have as vibrant a local web community as Manhattan does, and then obviously there's other neighborhoods that don't have any.
Totally.
So that's bad. We need those neighborhoods. Well, you know, your model is good for part of it, but there's so many neighborhoods that don't have local coverage, which is like why I was complaining about the Ithaca Journal if you're just tuning in. There's not enough funding for real vibrant local news because as cheap as you want to make it, local news is sort of still expensive. You got to pay a reporter a decent. I mean, we'll talk about how little we can pay our reporters. But, you know, you only get away with paying reporters so little. If Brian is still listening, but you pay your reporters, and then they have to earn a living. So it's challenging.
Yeah,
you need a
absolutely.
bunch of reporters. You can't just have one reporter.
Well, this is why I think the nonprofit foundation model is really best suited for places where there isn't a wealthy cost base. You know, our readers are sending us questions about SNAP benefits. You know, they're asking us about where to find a food bank. We can't build a membership program of $20 a month off of people who have those types of needs. So for us, a kind of philanthropically underwritten project makes the most sense. So it's just figuring out what model suits where you're at. And I think there is a kind of growing philanthropic understanding of the importance of local news.
Well, and there's the vacuum created by government that doesn't provide that information. I don't know why.
100%.
Why are people seeking SNAP benefits calling you? No offense.
no, 100%.
The government should be. They used to.
Well, that's the other thing that El Timpano in the Bay has actually built a playbook around this exact issue, where it's like, well, if we're providing this information, maybe we should be getting money from the government to be distributing public health information and these other connecting people to benefits in this way. And they have actually been able to secure some partnerships in that way. So that might be another revenue model for news in that we know how to get information out to the public better. Historically, they would have advertised with the New York Times and the Spanish publications, and today they might pay us to do the same thing.
And Gersh, you were telling us before this panel that you have had success at times at getting reader revenue, and you were giving us the example of congestion pricing. And I'm going to share more about that.
Well, so on occasion we'll do really intense periods of reporting where we just, what they used to say, flood the zone. Nice. When Governor Hochul had canceled congestion pricing back in June of, I guess it was 2024, it was supposed to start, and she canceled it right before it started. And we did literally in 10 days something like 45 stories. Pursuing every angle. Why'd she do it? Who'd she talk to? Who didn't she talk to? How are we going to make up the money? How are we going to, the cameras are already up. Are they going to be taken to, the whole thing. So at the end of that, or in the middle of it, we started posting, hey, by the way, we're really covering this very intently. You might want to click on this QR code and send us some money. And we're not like Channel 13. Remember in the 90s, Channel 13 would take a week where they would do a pledge drive. And it's like, I just want to watch McLeod Lehrer. And anyway, we don't do that. Once a year, we make a little pledge drive. We say, hey, look, we did these stories. Give us a little money. And please, But during that time, we was like, okay, this was really intense. We did some really good reporting, and we showed the world that Kathy Hochul was dead wrong on congestion pricing, and indeed she did turn the cameras back on.
Yeah.
And so we did raise, maybe we raised $5,000, $10,000, but it was very generous. If you're out there and you gave money, I thank you really seriously. And if you didn't give money, like, why not? Why didn't you give us money? No, but you have to keep the lights on, right? In other words, you can't just expect that we're just going to keep reporting. We've got a newsroom of 10 people, which for a local newsroom in New York City is actually really quite large, and it costs a lot of money. So it is nice. And at the end of the year, you'll see a QR code on Streets Blog, and we hope you'll give from the heart.
We have another viewer question from Harriet, and I think it's for both of you. You said earlier that Trump's antipathy toward the press trickles down to local journalism and journalists. How do you keep or win back the trust and support of your communities?
Well, yeah, I think that's what we were saying earlier around how we try and take people's relationship with us from the media, documented as part of the media, this kind of like big faceless thing that, just elicits strong emotions, to I am somebody who's going out, gathering information and doing my best job to try and give you an accurate account of what's happening, what this policy means, how this thing affects you. And I think the way that we're trying to do that is to humanize the people that work at Documented, through these different channels that we work on, WhatsApp, WeChat, TikTok, wherever it might be. On our Instagram, we're doing a lot more video, actually showing the reporters who work in the newsroom, try and build relationships with our readers where they actually see us as real humans. And I think when you see somebody as a genuine person, it's a lot harder to just paint them with the brush of just the media. Because even when it's, a celebrity journalist, they almost get dehumanized in that they just become this foil for all of your negative emotions. But if it's somebody who lives locally and is talking about issues that aren't featured in a lot of the national news, one of the biggest problems that we have, as far as our democracy, is that all news has been nationalized. Because of the hollowing out of local news, everybody sees all of their issues through this lens of the national media agenda. And if you're talking about congestion pricing, an issue that's super local, that is here in New York City, you're not hearing about it on CNN every day, and the people that are working behind it, that builds real trust.
Yeah, there's a flip side to that, unfortunately. Harriet, the issue is, you talked about trust in the community. The problem is a lot of the issues I cover, and your issues especially, immigration, are part of the culture war. And the problem is, once something becomes part of the culture war, it's not as easy to be trusted by half of the community, right? My readers, they know that it's true that Streets Blog is advocacy journalism, but the core of that is the journalism. We never write something that's not true. We never lie. We never willfully distort reality. And so half of the city respects that. The other half is like, no, but you're just advocating for a lifestyle that I don't like, i.e. the construction of a bike lane on West 72nd Street in a neighborhood where a lot of people get around by bike. So once it becomes part of the culture war, and we find we'll write about a bike lane and there'll be people protesting at events that we cover saying, well, and it's part of the culture war, so they say you want to take my car away. It's like, no, I don't want to take your car away. I want to make it easier for everybody to get around. And once it's part of the culture war, it's really so divisive, and winning that trust is hard because the other side, really, there's no other side in journalism. We're just trying to get the facts, but there is an other side in the culture wars. And I think that's one of the genius moves by President Trump, in that he degrades the very notion of trust in anything. Well, we don't have to go on to what President Trump does, but the degradation of trust forms on us versus them. Even when you're, journalists, we're just the referee usually. But I know that I'm joking because John Roberts famously said he's the referee, and the guy's probably the most biased Supreme Court justice since Rehnquist. Now we're in a different area, and I'm not a lawyer. But we are really the referee, ostensibly. But as you cover things, and you point out the injustice of a lot of these things that government does. Half of your not half of your readers, all your readers love that, but half of the people in the city are like, no, wait a minute, I'm on Trump's side on this. And
100%.
That's hard.
Well, we saw that on Nextdoor. We worked extensively on Nextdoor because a lot of Caribbean immigrants got their news on Nextdoor.
Next door.
Yes. So we did a survey of Caribbean immigrants and found a lot of them were actually getting information about their neighborhood through Nextdoor and Citizen. So we had a dedicated reporter who would just post on Nextdoor for years. And Nextdoor launched this whole new program after seeing us working on it. But the responses that we got there, especially during the asylum seeker busing, were a lot of vitriol.
Yeah.
And but I have to be honest that before Trump, it wasn't like we were beloved to the public.
Correct.
So there was always a time in which there's a sort of base level, vitriol or like strong emotion that journalism has always elicited. And I think that's kind of par for the course. And even during Trump's first administration was the first time someone ever thanked me for doing my job. They were like, thank you for doing
Yeah,
your
like
job.
you're a member of the military. or something.
Exactly, yeah, it was incredible. So there was a sort of flip side to it. I think what has happened, the trust building that we're trying to get, what I'm really talking about here, beyond what you're mentioning, is that we have reached a place where people just fundamentally do not believe things to be true unless they come from certain people. So that if you are considered a member of the media, instantly what you're writing is false. And it doesn't matter what, it could be the most innocuous thing, people consider it to be false. I think that is the new era that we've entered with Trump. And I think that's what we're trying to fight against. A lot of people have a handful of influencers that they watch on YouTube or TikTok who they just believe verbatim everything they say. And anything that doesn't come from them that they don't confirm, they don't believe it. And that is very detrimental to our democracy.
Yeah, and I think that ties in because we're wanting to sort of wrap up in the next few minutes and talk about looking ahead at the future of journalism. And I wanted to pose to all of you that if we ran this same panel 5 years from now, what do you hope will have changed for journalists in the coming years? And if there's anything that you're genuinely worried will look the same or be worse?
Well, 5 years.
5 years. I think that the public understanding of the importance of local news, I really feel like we're building towards that. That when we started Documented 8 years ago, the number of people who are even aware, the Pew did a study, I think 5 years ago, where they asked people, do you think your local news outlet is thriving? And most people said, yeah, I think they're doing great. And this was like the peak of newspaper shuttering. And I think the tide is turning on that. And I think people feeling like it's part of their civic duty to, even if they're not reading the news every day, supporting a local publication, trying to engage in local news. I think I would love to get to a place like that.
It's a real challenge because I also find, New York's a tough town to live in just to get around, whatever. I find that there are a lot of people who are kind of pulling back from the news as like something they do, as a habit, because in some ways it's easier to just trust a couple of voices, maybe listen to Brian Lair in the morning, as revanchist and retrograde as that show is. But what I mean is just, and then not really thinking too much about it. I've got my friends, I've got my family, I've got my hobbies.
Right.
I'm worried that may be the direction this goes. I mean, first of all, we don't even know where the country's going, right? The president is probably going to be president until he dies, right? We don't even know if he's going to leave office.
Right.
So to talk about journalism in 5 years is impossible because we don't even know what kind of country we're going to have.
It's true. People are switching off as a mental health
That's right.
benefit.
Well, you have. Well, reporters are doing it too. I mean, no offense, but you try to get your reporters on a weekend, you probably can't reach them, right? They got to cut it off. I mean, when I got into the business, we worked. I'm not saying it because I'm old. I'm not saying because we worked from morning until like 1 in the morning. It's just because it was so much news. But you got to turn that off. So the country's doing that too, I think.
Anything you would want to add, Mike?
No, from a legal standpoint, I'm encouraged by the growth of clinics like ours and other pro bono outlets that can provide the legal help to news outlets. And we've seen a flourishing of those sorts of organizations in the last 5 to 10 years. So hopefully that will continue. A lot of them are funded by foundations and other sources like that. So I hope that the funding will continue and that organizations like ours can continue providing the legal help that local outlets need.
And speaking of other clinics, we got a shout out in the chat from Christina Lee, who's one of our alums of our clinic, who went on to the clinic at Georgia and just moved over to the clinic at Yale.
That's
So,
great.
all right, and so we're coming towards the end of the panel, and I'd like to sort of wrap it up with a final question for you all. How is local journalism doing right now?
Well, like I said, I think there's a lot of journalism being done. I think the money's drying up and it's hard to keep it going. But yeah, I feel like as a New York City resident, I feel very well informed, frankly. But I don't think that's true elsewhere at all.
Yeah, I think we're pretty blessed generally in New York with a lot of great news outlets. I think local news that's high quality, that's not in English, is really still struggling. And I think we have a long way to go on that front. But as I said previously, there's just so much exciting innovation happening in New York and across the country. So I feel really excited.
Thank you all for this conversation today.
Anytime.